August 30th, 1945. Atsugi Airfield, 30 miles southwest of Tokyo. The C-54 transport descended through broken clouds, its shadow racing across a landscape of ash and ruin. Inside the aircraft, General Douglas MacArthur sat motionless, corncob pipe clenched between his teeth, his weathered hands resting on his knees. Through the small window, Japan spread below him, a nation reduced to rubble and starvation. 6 days earlier, Emperor Hirohito had announced surrender over crackling radio waves. Now, MacArthur was arriving to accept it in person, to take command of a devastated empire, with 80 million souls, wondering if they would live to see another spring. The wheels touched down hard on the damaged runway. MacArthur rose, adjusted his crushed cap with its tarnished gold braid, and stepped into the doorway. Hot wind rushed past, carrying the acrid smell of burned wood and, something worse, the lingering stench of death that still hung over the ruins of Japanese cities. The general descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, each step measured. Around the airfield, thousands of Japanese soldiers stood at attention, their rifles stacked, their faces hollow with hunger and defeat. American paratroopers from the 11th Airborne Division fanned out in defensive positions, fingers near triggers, eyes scanning for threats that might still lurk in this shattered nation. MacArthur touched the tarmac and paused. No bands played, no flags waved. This was not the triumphant liberation of Manila, where cheering Filipinos had mobbed his jeep 8 months earlier. This was something different, something unprecedented in human history. An American general was about to govern an ancient empire that had never known foreign occupation, to reshape a feudal society that had resisted Western influence for centuries. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on his shoulders as heavily as the humid August heat. He climbed into a battered sedan for the drive toward Yokohama. The convoy moved slowly through countryside that resembled photographs from the Western Front of the previous war. But this devastation was worse, more complete, more apocalyptic in scale. The convoy rolled north on damaged roads, weaving around bomb craters and collapsed bridges hastily repaired with wooden planks. MacArthur leaned forward, studying the landscape with the intensity of a man reading an unwelcome prophecy. Rice paddies lay abandoned, their irrigation channels broken and dry. Villages that had stood for centuries were now collections of blackened posts and melted roof tiles. Occasionally, figures appeared beside the road, skeletal women in tattered kimonos, children with distended bellies, old men whose faces registered neither hope nor fear, only the blank exhaustion of those who had survived the unsurvivable. Major Fabian Bowers, MacArthur's aide and Japanese interpreter, sat across from the general, watching his commander's face for reaction. Bowers had studied at the University of Tokyo before the war, had walked these same roads when they connected thriving towns to prosperous cities. Now he struggled to recognize anything familiar. "Sir, the briefing papers didn't capture," he began, then fell silent. No briefing paper could capture this. No intelligence report could convey the scale of what 3 years of firebombing had accomplished. MacArthur removed his pipe, tapped it against his palm. "How many died in the air raids, Bowers?" "Estimates range from 300,000 to 500,000, sir. The March 9th attack on Tokyo alone killed more than 100,000 in a single night, more than Hiroshima or Nagasaki." The general nodded slowly. He had authorized many of those raids, had approved the strategic bombing campaign that employed Curtis LeMay's low-altitude incendiary attacks specifically designed to burn Japan's wooden cities to ash. Military necessity, they called it. Shortening the war, they called it. Saving American lives that would have been lost in an invasion. All true, all rational. All justified by the calculus of total war. But calculus didn't account for the woman he saw now, squatting beside a destroyed home, methodically sorting through ashes with her bare hands, searching for anything, a nail, a pot, a fragment of her former life worth salvaging. September 2nd, 1945. Yokohama Harbor, aboard the USS Missouri. MacArthur stood on the battleship's deck as Japanese officials signed the instruments of surrender, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, leaning heavily on his cane, laboriously climbed the accommodation ladder. His wooden leg, lost to a Korean nationalist's bomb in 1932, made each step an ordeal of dignity and humiliation. Behind him came General Yoshijiro Umezu, Army Chief of Staff, his face carved from granite, refusing to show emotion even as he sealed the death of Imperial Japan's military ambitions. The ceremony lasted 23 minutes. MacArthur's hands trembled slightly as he signed, not from fear or nervousness, but from the weight of the moment. When it ended, he spoke briefly into the microphone, his voice carrying across the harbor to the ruins of Yokohama beyond. "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." Noble words, but as he returned to shore that afternoon and began the drive into Tokyo proper, MacArthur wondered if hope alone could resurrect what American B-29 seconds had destroyed. The capital of the Japanese Empire sprawled before him in endless devastation. 16 square miles of the city center had been incinerated in the March firebombing, an area larger than the entire city of San Francisco. The Imperial Palace stood isolated among the ruins, like a green island in a sea of ash. The convoy navigated streets lined with rubble. Makeshift shanties, constructed from scrap metal and charred wood, huddled in the shadows of gutted buildings. Women pumped water from broken mains, filling dented buckets and pots. Children with shaved heads, a measure against lice, played in the ruins, their games somehow finding joy in landscapes of despair. An old man pulled a cart loaded with salvaged bricks, his shoulders bent nearly horizontal with the effort, his bare feet bleeding through makeshift straw sandals. MacArthur established his headquarters in the Dai-ichi Life Insurance Building, one of the few modern structures still standing in central Tokyo. From his sixth-floor office, he could see across the moat to the Imperial Palace, where Emperor Hirohito remained sequestered, a living god reduced to defeated sovereign, awaiting his fate at the hands of the conquerors. The general's staff worked to establish command of the occupation. 8,000 American soldiers were already in Tokyo, with hundreds of thousands more streaming into ports across Japan. But numbers weren't the problem. The problem was what to do with them, what to do with this broken nation now under American control. In the first days of September, MacArthur spent hours at his window, watching Tokyo attempt to resurrect itself from ashes. Every morning, streams of civilians trudged into the ruined city center, searching for work that didn't exist, for food that couldn't be found, for relatives who would never return. Japan's economy had collapsed completely. Industrial production stood at less than 10% of pre-war levels. The fishing fleet that had fed the nation lay rusting at the bottom of the Pacific. Rice stockpiles were nearly exhausted. Medical supplies had run out months ago. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and malnutrition were killing thousands weekly. His advisors brought reports that painted an even bleaker picture. Japan's infrastructure was shattered. 70% of Tokyo had been destroyed, along with 50% of Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe. The national rail system operated at 20% capacity. Coal mines lay flooded and abandoned. The banking system had collapsed. A nation of 72 million people, the population had been 80 million, but starvation and disease were reducing that number, daily teetered on the brink of complete societal breakdown. Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, commanding the 8th Army, visited MacArthur's office on September 5th. "Doug, we're looking at mass starvation this winter. The food distribution system has completely failed. The black market is the only economy that functions, and it's controlled by Yakuza gangs." MacArthur continued staring out the window. "What are you recommending?" "Emergency food imports. At least 500,000 tons of grain before winter. Otherwise, we're going to have millions dead by spring." Section 5. The Weight of Decision. That night, MacArthur sat alone in his office long after his staff had departed. A single lamp illuminated the maps spread across his desk. Maps of Japan's devastation, charts of industrial capacity, reports on food supplies and public health. Outside, Tokyo lay dark and silent. Electricity ran only a few hours daily, and most of that went to essential services. The city that had once blazed with neon and streetlights now resembled medieval Europe, lit by candles and cooking fires flickering in the ruins. He picked up a photograph from his desk, a Japanese child, perhaps 5 years old, sitting beside a destroyed home, staring at the camera with eyes that held no childhood innocence, only the flat gaze of someone who had seen too much death. An American photographer had taken it in Hiroshima 2 weeks earlier. MacArthur kept it as a reminder of what this war had cost, what his orders had accomplished. The general had spent his life in the military. He was 65 years old, had first worn the uniform in 1899, had served in the Philippines during the insurrection, in France during the First World War, had commanded armies across the Pacific for 4 brutal years. He understood war's mathematics, the exchange of lives for objectives, the calculation of acceptable casualties, the brutal logic that justified burning cities to save soldiers. But mathematics didn't explain what he felt now, standing in the ashes of an enemy capital, responsible not for destroying Japan but for resurrecting it. His orders from Washington were clear enough in principle: demilitarize Japan, democratize its government, establish a stable regime that would never threaten peace again. But the directives were vague on implementation. How do you democratize a society that had known only imperial rule for 2,000 years? How do you demilitarize a warrior culture where dying for the emperor was the highest honor? How do you establish stability when people are starving in the streets? Section 6. The Meeting with Hirohito. September 27, 1945. The American Embassy, Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito arrived at the embassy precisely at 10 o'clock, riding in a battered Mercedes with curtained windows. MacArthur waited in the reception room, dressed in standard khaki uniform with no decorations. He had deliberately chosen not to wear dress uniform, not to stand on ceremony with excessive military formality. This meeting was already humiliating enough for the Japanese ruler, without adding theatrical displays of dominance. Hirohito entered, accompanied by an interpreter. He was small, barely 5 feet tall, wearing a formal morning coat that hung awkwardly on his thin frame. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he removed his top hat. For 3 weeks, he had waited in the imperial palace, expecting arrest, trial, execution, the fate of defeated emperors throughout history. Instead, MacArthur had requested a meeting, not a summons, not an order, a request. The two men shook hands, the first time in Japanese history an emperor had shaken hands with anyone. MacArthur gestured toward chairs positioned before the fireplace. They sat, the interpreter between them, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then Hirohito leaned forward, his voice quiet but steady. "I come to you, General MacArthur, to offer myself to the judgment of the powers you represent, as the one to bear sole responsibility for every political and military decision made and action taken by my people in the conduct of war." The interpreter translated. MacArthur felt something shift in his understanding. He had expected excuses, evasions, the typical deflections of defeated leaders seeking to preserve their power. Instead, here was a man offering to sacrifice himself for his nation. It might be political theater, probably was political theater, but it was effective theater, touching something in MacArthur's sense of honor and duty. Section 7. The Path Forward. They talked for 40 minutes. MacArthur learned that Hirohito was not the divine fanatic he had imagined, but a soft-spoken man with a passion for marine biology, who had inherited a throne he never wanted and presided over a military expansion he could not control. The emperor described the crushing pressure from the army generals who had dominated Japanese politics since the 1920s, men who worshipped military glory and treated the emperor as a rubber stamp for their ambitions. "I was told," Hirohito said quietly, "that war with America was necessary to protect Japan's security. I was told we would win quickly, that America lacked the will to fight. I was told many things that proved untrue. MacArthur listened, recognizing the familiar patterns of military leadership disconnected from reality, of plans based on wishful thinking rather than honest assessment. He had seen the same failures in the American military, had fought against the same institutional blindness throughout his career. The enemy, he realized, wasn't fundamentally different from his own side, just humans making decisions, sometimes terrible decisions, with consequences they couldn't foresee. After Hirohito departed, MacArthur returned to his office and summoned his senior staff. Brigadier General Courtney Whitney, chief of the government section, arrived first, followed by Colonel Charles Cades and a dozen other officers who would shape occupation policy. The general laid out his decision. We're not going to put the emperor on trial. We're going to use him to stabilize Japan and implement reforms. Without Hirohito's cooperation, we'll face guerrilla warfare and civil breakdown. With it, we can transform this nation peacefully. Whitney objected immediately. General, Washington expects war crimes, trials. The American public wants justice. The emperor commanded. The emperor will serve justice better alive than dead, MacArthur interrupted. We're going to rebuild Japan, not destroy it further. That means we need Japanese cooperation, and that means we need the emperor's authority to legitimate our reforms. Section 8. The Reform Vision. Over the following weeks, MacArthur's headquarters developed a comprehensive plan for Japan's transformation. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, as the occupation government became known, would exercise absolute authority, but would govern through existing Japanese institutions rather than ruling directly. It was revolutionary. Instead of military government imposing foreign rule, SCAP would issue directives that Japanese officials would implement, maintaining the appearance of Japanese sovereignty while ensuring American control. The reforms MacArthur envisioned were radical. First, complete demilitarization, not just disbanding the military, but prohibiting Japan from ever maintaining armed forces again. Second, land reform to break the power of feudal landlords who had controlled peasant farmers for centuries. Third, educational reform to eliminate militaristic indoctrination and introduce democratic values. Fourth, economic reforms to break up the zaibatsu, the family-controlled industrial conglomerates that had financed Japan's military expansion. Fifth, and most controversially, a new constitution that would transform Japan from absolute monarchy to constitutional democracy. You're talking about remaking Japanese society from the ground up, Eichelberger said when MacArthur outlined the plan. That's never been done. No occupying power has ever succeeded in fundamentally transforming an enemy nation. MacArthur nodded. Then we'll be the first. Because the alternative is leaving Japan as it was, militaristic, feudal, expansionist. That Japan will rise again and threaten peace within a generation. We have to break that cycle now, while we have the authority and opportunity to do it. Section 9. Winter of Hunger. December 1945. Tokyo. The feared winter arrived with killing cold. Japan had no coal for heating, no warm clothing to distribute, insufficient food to feed its people. In Tokyo, the official daily ration fell to barely 1,000 calories, half what a working adult needed to survive. In rural areas, conditions were worse. Farmers hoarded rice, refusing to sell at government-mandated prices when black market prices were 20 times higher. The distribution system collapsed completely. People began dying in the streets. MacArthur authorized emergency food shipments from American stockpiles, first 300,000 tons, then another 500,000, then more as the crisis deepened. It strained military logistics already stretched thin by demobilization and the needs of occupation forces scattered across the Pacific. But MacArthur insisted. We can't reform a nation of corpses, he told his supply officers. Get them food, whatever it takes. The general made daily tours through Tokyo's streets, his car moving slowly through crowds of starving civilians. He saw children begging outside military installations, women offering themselves to American soldiers for chocolate bars and cigarettes, families burning their furniture for warmth in unheated apartments. The devastation was worse than anything he had witnessed in 4 years of combat. At least in war, there was purpose to the suffering, strategy behind the destruction. This was different. This was the aftermath, the consequence, the bill coming due for decisions made in distant headquarters and government offices. His staff worried about his safety. "Sir, there's genuine anger on the streets. Some of these people blame America for their situation. You're taking unnecessary risks with these tours." MacArthur dismissed the concerns. "If I'm not willing to walk among them, how can I ask them to trust American intentions? They need to see that we're not hiding behind walls, that we're here to help, not just to rule." Section 10. The Constitutional Revolution. February 19, 46. SCAP Headquarters. MacArthur made his most consequential decision. The Japanese government had submitted a draft constitution that preserved imperial sovereignty and maintained the old power structures with minimal changes. It was unacceptable, a transparent attempt to continue the pre-war system under new labels. MacArthur rejected it and gave his staff 1 week to draft an entirely new constitution. Colonel Charles Cades led a team of young military lawyers working around the clock. They studied constitutions from around the world, American, British, French, German, and crafted a document that would fundamentally restructure Japanese society. The emperor would become a symbolic figurehead, with no political power. Sovereignty would rest with the people, not the throne. A bicameral legislature would govern through parliamentary democracy. Women would receive equal rights, including the vote. Land reform would be mandatory. Labor unions would be legal and protected. And most revolutionary of all, Article 9 would forever renounce war as a sovereign right, prohibiting Japan from maintaining military forces for anything except self-defense. The draft reached MacArthur's desk on February 10th. He read it twice, then called Cades to his office. "This is the most liberal constitution in history. You're proposing to give Japanese citizens rights that Americans don't fully enjoy. Women's equality, universal health care, protection for labor organizing. This is going to generate enormous controversy back home." "Yes, sir," Cades acknowledged. "But if we're going to transform Japan, we need to break completely with the past. Half measures won't work." MacArthur signed his approval. On February 13, he presented the draft to Japanese officials, making clear it was non-negotiable. Either they accepted this constitution and implemented it through proper channels, or SCAP would impose it by fiat. Shocked, Japanese cabinet members read through the document, recognizing it as revolutionary, the end of everything their nation had been for 2,000 years. Foreign Minister Shigeru Yoshida, who would later become Prime Minister, met privately with MacArthur. "General, this constitution, it will destroy Japanese tradition, Japanese culture. We are asking you to reconsider, to give us more time to develop our own." "No," MacArthur interrupted. "Japanese tradition led to Pearl Harbor, led to Nanking, led to the devastation outside this window. That tradition is finished. You'll implement this constitution, or I'll find Japanese officials who will." Section 11. Transformation takes root. By spring of 1946, the reforms were beginning to take effect. Land reform broke up feudal estates, redistributing property to farmers who had worked as tenants for generations. 5 million acres changed hands, creating a new class of independent farmers who suddenly had stake in Japan's stability and prosperity. Educational reform purged militaristic content from textbooks, introduced democratic values, made schooling compulsory through 9th grade. Women voted for the first time in April's elections, sending 39 women to the new Diet, more female legislators than any other democracy at the time. The Zaibatsu were being dismantled, though less completely than MacArthur hoped. American business interests lobbied against breaking up the industrial combines too thoroughly, arguing it would cripple Japan's economy. MacArthur compromised, allowing some consolidation to remain, while ensuring no single family could control multiple industries. Labor unions exploded in membership, growing from practically nothing to over 5 million members within a year. Workers who had been voiceless peasants in the old system suddenly had organization, representation, power to negotiate for better conditions. But the human cost remained staggering. Malnutrition continued, killing thousands monthly. Tuberculosis ravaged a population with weakened immune systems and no access to medicine. Housing shortages meant millions lived in shacks and burned-out buildings. The economy remained in shambles, with inflation destroying the value of the yen and unemployment exceeding 30% in urban areas. MacArthur pushed for more food aid, more medical supplies, more resources devoted to basic humanitarian needs. He clashed repeatedly with Washington officials who wanted to reduce occupation costs, who questioned why American taxpayers should rebuild an enemy that had bombed Pearl Harbor. The general argued that abandoning Japan now would waste the victory, would create conditions for future conflict, just as surely as abandoning Germany after the First World War had enabled Hitler's rise. Section 12. The Long View. May 1947. Tokyo. MacArthur stood again at his window in the Dai-ichi building, watching Tokyo slowly resurrect. 2 years had passed since his arrival. The city looked different now, not prosperous, not healthy, but alive with possibility. Construction crews worked on new buildings, shops were reopening, children played in parks that had been ash fields. The transformation remained incomplete, fragile, reversible, but it was real. The new constitution had been adopted, ratified through proper procedures that gave it legitimacy in Japanese eyes. Emperor Hirohito had renounced his divinity in a radio address, declaring himself human, a seemingly small gesture that fundamentally altered the relationship between ruler and ruled. War crimes trials had convicted and executed the military leaders most responsible for atrocities, while sparing the emperor and thousands of lower-level officials whose cooperation was needed for governance. Japan would never again threaten its neighbors with military force. The nation was being reborn as a democracy, imperfect and struggling, but genuinely different from the militaristic empire that had terrorized Asia. It was working this unprecedented experiment in transforming enemies into allies, in rebuilding rather than punishing. MacArthur thought back to that day in September 1945, when he first stood amid Tokyo's ruins. He had understood then that revenge would be easy, destruction simple, punishment satisfying, but none of that would secure lasting peace. Only transformation could do that painful, difficult, revolutionary transformation that required looking past immediate anger to long-term consequences. The general picked up his pipe, packed it slowly, struck a match. Outside his window, Tokyo continued its resurrection. Former enemies were becoming allies. A defeated empire was becoming a democracy. The future that had seemed impossible 2 years ago was taking shape in the ruins of the past. It would take decades to complete, would require patience and resources and commitment far beyond what anyone had imagined in 1945. But standing there in the spring sunshine, watching a city rebuild itself from ashes, Douglas MacArthur knew they had chosen the right path. Not revenge, renewal. Not punishment, partnership. Not destruction, hope. The work was far from finished, but it had begun.